Welcome to the Gals Guide podcast. Join us on an adventure to get to know famous and infamous women from around the world. Each of our presenters has a pick. Is she ancient history? Is she breaking news? Is she safe for work? Well, that's up to each presenter. All we know is that...
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
Welcome back. I am Riwo, and I'm joined by Katie and Bonnie, and we are sharing our resistance pick. So Bonnie already talked about the 4B movement, and Katie talked about Queen Boudica. But before we dive back in, I want to get to know something rebellious about our gal pals. So my question is, it's a very overarching question. In what ways have you shown resistance? Dun, 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 dun.
I mean, I think that I have mainly shown resistance in smaller ways.
Yeah.
Kind of like you said, the more silent acts.
Mm-hmm.
I know there's definitely places I won't shop because of how they treat women or other minorities. I also don't know. I was trying to think of a clever way to talk about how the airport's authority bothers me, but I don't have it.
Gotcha. There you go. But the airport authority bothers you. There you go.
I try to resist the airport.
Yeah.
Yes. And
Fair.
also really resistant to participating in anything that I think tears somebody else down.
Yeah.
So, whether that's something gossipy at the office or something somebody observes that I don't think's the right way that you should talk about somebody, that I definitely resist. I won't participate in that.
Yeah.
And try to redirect.
There you go. Absolutely brilliant. Yes. Bon, what about you?
My whole life. No, I've been like resisting stuff for a long time in small ways. Like Katie, like even as like a kid, I was very much a tomboy, and a lot of that I think stemmed from the McDonald's toys, like for girls, were the shittiest fucking toys. They're like, you can have a 2-inch Barbie that has some hair with a really crappy hairbrush, and you can brush her hair. And it's like, or you can have Hot Wheels and launch a car off of something like.
Mm-hmm.
So I've always had a bit of the resistance in me, and now I do artwork that is educational, but it's also very resisty.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. I'm kind of right there with you. I've been resisting and rebelling kind of my whole life in different ways. I mean, choosing a different religion other than my parents, and kind of in a resistance mode of that of, okay, well, if anybody from the family comes to visit, hide all my Buddha statues. That kind of like, that was mostly like, I don't want to have the conversation. You know what I mean? It was like, I can put all this back and just not have to worry about the conversation. But even, I don't know, little things like starting a women's history lending library. I think that's a wonderful little bit of resistance to be like, no, I think women are people. And I think our history is worth sharing and celebrating and spotlighting as well. Yeah. Who would have thunk it? Resistance and the three of us? No. I think it's lovely. So do you want to hear who I have for you of a glorious resistance gal? So I have for you Annie Pachen, and her heroic tale of resistance while being imprisoned for 21 years in a Chinese prison. So it's not going to be a happy story, but I did really want to share the story, and I got very excited about it. But a little bit of context is also kind of needed for this story because it's needed in a political way, in a historical way, and also in my personal connection. The personal connection is where I get excited to be able to share the story. So I also wanted to keep all of those context things in relation to the actual woman and not go too far down a rabbit hole or off basis with any of that kind of good stuff to keep it about resistance. So the historical context about Annie is she was born in Tibet. And Tibet is known as the roof of the world, mostly because of its elevation and because of its mountains. It has Mount Everest and it has K2. It's near Nepal and India. Also, Tibet was home to the Dalai Lama and many of his reincarnations. And then in the way, way backs, Tibet was a military empire that actually turned to Buddhism in the 6th century and changed to a non-violent spiritual nation. So you get this kind of ebb and flow throughout time. Now, the political context before sharing her story is that China invaded Tibet in 1949, and the Dalai Lama was forced to flee in exile 10 years after that. And maybe even in the 90s, you might have seen Free Tibet, like bumper stickers and T-shirts. And there was even benefit concerts and stuff like that of Free Tibet in that movement. Today, Tibet is no longer a country. It is under Chinese control. And then lastly, as context, is my personal connection. So I was in my late teens when I learned about the Tibetan resistance movement to the Chinese invasion. I've watched throughout my life many documentaries and read books about this time, all of which usually brings me to some kind of emotional tear-jerking, moment where feeling deep empathy and compassion for this time period. I've also had the honor of meeting many Tibetan refugees in Indiana, in Colorado, in Los Angeles, as well as in Georgia. So I have a personal connection to the people of Tibet. I also practice Tibetan Buddhism, if I haven't mentioned that before. So I'm also trying to learn the language of Tibet, but I don't learn English that well. So don't have a lot of faith for me for, learning the Tibetan and speaking that any better than I speak of the English, because that's not. Yeah, that's grasping.
I think you do a beautiful job with your Buddhist pronunciations.
Yes,
when
those
you've read things about meditations and stuff. Absolutely beautiful.
Those come from a lot more practice and a teacher.
Yeah.
So we're English. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Practice and a teacher. But thank you. But so all of that context, I will tell you what I know of Annie's story. So Annie was born in 1933 in Tibet, and she was an only child. And her father was the chief of the Ganzhou country, that area of Tibet. She took refuge in the Dharma, which means she became a Buddhist at age 8, and she started a deity practice. At age 17, her father arranged a marriage for her. She didn't like it, so she ran away to a monastery. She saw her aunt, who was a nun, and she saw her mother, who was a wife. And let's just say she made a choice between those two women and the future and the lives that they had that she wanted. Her father then promised to cancel the engagement if she came back home. It is possible that that marriage was so that Annie could keep her position of power, basically so she could be the chieftain of the village once her father had passed on. So it could have been political. Because Annie was by her father's side at meetings with the local chieftains. He did even ask, "Can I teach you the ways of being a chieftain?" So he was very respectful in that, do you want this life that he was living to be passed on to you? But a few months after China invaded and forced the Dalai Lama to sign over control of Tibet, Annie started hearing stories of Chinese soldiers. They were taking children against their will for re-education. Parents and children who resisted were sent to labor camps. And those who insisted they were pacifists and they would not hurt anybody, like the monks and the nuns of the country, were actually forced to kill animals. So it was these horrific acts that they were forcing these people to do. And intentions really grew. And so Annie really divided her education in two ways. So one is that she would practice her religious trainings at the monastery, learning compassion and mindfulness. And she would also learn how to be a soldier like her father. She would learn how to shoot a gun. She would learn how to ride horses. And she would learn how to lead a resistance army. So tens of thousands of karmapas. Karmapas are either monks or lay Buddhists, people who have taken the Buddhist refuge but are not donning the robes. Tens of thousands of them were taking a stronghold position in the hills and were an armed resistance to the Chinese, and Annie and her father were among them. But her father died in one of the battles, and she became chief of her clan. She was 25. Yeah, a lot of responsibility in the middle of a war zone.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
I can imagine myself at 25. No, I would not be equipped. Like, I could upset somebody and maybe have some sarcastic comments, but not lead a resistance army. But she led 600 resistance fighters to then join other Tibetan resistance warrior groups. So as they were kind of scattered around the hills and the countryside, they gathered together not only those different battling groups, but also the thousands of families that were displaced as well, that were trying to either resist or those that were trying to run to freedom. So she was very helpful in knowing these big groups, getting them together, but then organizing them to actually disperse. Because the smaller the groups were, the less visible they would be, and the more likely that they could hide out or that they could fight longer and stay in the battle, that sort of thing. So having them less visible was wonderful. But she was also on the defense as well with patrols. She was very actively engaged in armed warfare. The CIA was also helping the Tibetan rebels at this time. But it's safe to say the Chinese forces were just overwhelming. There was just far too many of them, and very well organized as well. So when it came to the Buddhist ethos of nonviolence, this is what she said. She said, to be truly a Buddhist, you must be loving and always compassionate. But I was faced with a particular situation, and I thought I had to do what was right at the time. So, very difficult choice. When Annie heard of the fall of the Tibetan guerrillas, that's guerrillas with a U, right? You know, the kind of, that kind of guerrillas. They were a group known as the Kushi Gandruk, and they were out of Lhasa. I will tell you that I know that Druk means a very powerful dragon in Tibetan, so I like that they had the very powerful dragon in its name. But when they fell, they were kind of like, I don't want to say the Pierce de Resistance because that's a French resistance team, but you know what I'm saying? Like, they were a really good group that was really holding a stronghold. But when they fell, she knew it was time they needed to escape. So Annie was actually with the three women in her life. She was with her, it was her mother, and it was her aunt. They were all together. Oh, and her grandmother. Sorry, that is the three people. I was thinking the third person was her. Sorry, her mother, her aunt, and her grandmother. They traveled on foot to India for nearly a month before they were captured by the Chinese. And this begins her 21 years of imprisonment. I will also say going on foot from Tibet to India is up and through those mountains. It's very treacherous. It's very dangerous just to walk it when you are not being chased by, a group. So that walk is already hard. So, yeah. So she was, during her imprisonment, she was interrogated, she was beaten, she wore leg irons for over a year. She was moved around a lot from one prison to another prison. And many times she was sent to a prison that would be considered the worst of the worst prisons. One of the ones she went to were for those who were considered guilty of the most serious crimes. She was held there in isolation for 9 months. And she refused to denounce her religion. She also rebuked an officer, is the reason why she was in solitary confinement. She was then held at the Deprachi prison for 11 years. This prison was located in Lhasa and is quite infamous, but also Lhasa is a holy place to Tibetans as well. And in that spot, prisoners were forbidden from saying or doing anything relating to the Tibetan culture. So they could not speak in Tibetan. They could not participate in any Tibetan religious or cultural practices. They were forced to wear Chinese uniforms, and they were forced to speak and learn Chinese or to not speak at all, right? When Annie was released from prison in 1981, she was 48 years old. And so this is what kind of hits me in the feels because I turned 48 this year. So I'm just going, man, if my life would just be starting anew out of prison at 48, that's a lot of life. That's a lot of stuff you'd miss, right? Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. So that moment of reflection of what did your life look like from age 27 to 48? Because she didn't have that, right?
Yeah.
She said, I went to prison a young woman and I came out an old woman. Now, I didn't like that line because the old woman part, hold on. Well, I mean, I get it and it's true. She continued to say, no one in my family survived but me. They were arrested. They bound my hands and feet. They hung me upside down and interrogated me. They beat me continuously. I would pass out and they would throw more water on me and beat me more. They shackled me for a year. They put a hole in the ground and forced me to live in my own feces. And all of the prisoners suffered the same. I know, right? So when she was released, she went on a religious pilgrimage. Of all the things that she wanted to do from her release, that's what she did. She went to the 3 great monasteries of Tibet, the Sera, the Darprang, and the Ganden, all of which were really, really damaged during the Cultural Revolution. She also went to Samaya and she learned the should practice. So the should practice is of severance, and I have taken lessons in this practice. I'm not good at it. It's really hard. But when I saw that she was doing the practice, I was like, okay, I get this because that's a hard one. From 1987 to 1989, there was a series of protests and demonstrations, sometimes called Tibetan unrest. This is where we start to see in the 90s the Free Tibet movement, the concerts and all that stuff. It's because of what was happening in Tibet. So once again, people were calling for Tibetan independence. And actually, Annie was part of some of those demonstrations. She did start to get word that people wanted to arrest her again. And thank goodness she didn't want that. She'd been there, done that, and didn't want it again.
Yeah.
Right? So she escaped to Nepal. And she went over Mount Kailash on foot. And she walked to Dharamsala to meet the Dalai Lama, who was in India at Dharamsala. So she settled there. She settled at the Ganden Choling Nunnery. And she traveled much of her life, the rest of her life, talking about Tibetan resistance. And she said, quote, sometimes I feel such anger for the Chinese. My life, and like so many others, passed in suffering. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, said that we must not hate the Chinese. Even in my time in caves where she meditated, she still struggles with anger. And I'm like, thank you for being authentic about that.
Yeah.
She did write an autobiography. She wrote it in the year 2000. It is called Sorrow Mountain, My Journey of a Tibetan Warrior Nun. And she died 2 years after the autobiography came out. She did live to the age of 69. That is a very long life for a warrior, right?
Yeah.
So, yay. And in her book, she wrote, as for me, the story will go like this. She led her people to fight against the Chinese. She was present at the protest in Lhasa. She worked to save ancient spiritual teachings. When I die, my story will be left. And her name, Annie Pachen, means nun, big courage.
Wow, that's perfect.
Right? Exactly. So that is Annie Patchwin, not to be confused with Anna Paquin, the actress from Interview with the Vampire and True Blood, but Annie Patchen,
Yes.
the glorious Tibetan warrior. So yeah, she hit me in the feels in a lot of areas.
Absolutely.
This is true. Any questions on glorious Annie Patchen?
That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to let go of anger if I spent 2 decades in those conditions. That's
Yep.
a lot.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, more than a lot.
I heard another monk who was also in prison, and they said, "What was the worst part of your imprisonment?" And he said, "I almost hated the Chinese."
Aww,
Just
oh
feeling
gosh.
hatred for your prison. That was the worst
Yeah.
thing. And I'm like going, I get that. And wow, you are better than me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, almost lost the love for his fellow human being and started hating. And it's like, oh no.
Aw.
Yep.
More power to him.
Exactly. Well, I had to get a Tibetan freedom fighter in there some point.
Absolutely.
Might as well start it off the gate, right?
Mhm.
Sweet. All right. Do you want me to wrap it up?
Yes, first month of 2025.
That. What do you know? So, well, that will wrap up Resistance Month. But don't worry, we're coming back. Join us next week as we learn about women who embody solidarity. So, gals who transform rebellion from a lone act of resistance into a movement. Thanks for listening. Want to learn about more women of history? Gals Guide opened a unique women's history lending library. Come visit and explore our collection. Learn more at galsguide.org. Thanks for listening.